Hey there, sports psych enthusiasts. I'm Dr. Colin Fehr, and I want to share my passion with you. I love talking about ways to unleash the power of the mind. This recording is part of a larger lecture series I've created in an effort to make sports psychology concepts more accessible to a larger audience. The information contained in this series is especially well suited for students of sports psychology and is presented in a way that makes for easy listening for all. Welcome to Sports Psych Concepts.
All right, everybody, welcome to this latest edition of the Sports Psych Concepts lecture series. I'm Dr. Colin Fehr. Want to talk to you today about concentration and maybe even how you can improve it. So Bill Russell was a famous basketball player in the NBA, one of the most winningest basketball players in history, and he claimed that concentration and mental toughness are the margins of victory. I love that quote. I refer to it often. And that is what we're going to talk about, is what he said, concentration. So we're going to define it. I'll talk about this sort of spectrum between overload and underload and how that relates to concentration, the ever so infamous reality of choking for many athletes, some really well-known examples of that are out there. Also these dimensions of attention, right? Because when we say concentration, really that's sustained focus, but then attention, selective attention, there's some different terms out there. So we'll bring those in for sure. So how do we develop that sort of selective attention and overcome the numerous myriad distractors that are there? And so we'll hit on some tips and drills and strategies that we can do. As I have mentioned in previous recordings, this is one of those areas that athletes tend to like to work on in terms of mental skill development, because you can do skills and drills and a lot like you can for physical skills. So with that, let's plow right ahead into the content. So to concentrate, again, concentration, to define it, it's sustained focus. It's our ability to selectively attend to the relevant cues, because you have all of these different things coming at us when we're in a competition environment, any sort of performance environment. And so the ability to concentrate is to filter out all of those irrelevant things and just focus on the relevant things. And being able to sustain that is the key when we're talking about concentration. Okay, so to bear down and concentrate, focus, like what are we talking about there? Okay, sustaining it, focusing on the right things. So mindfulness is going to be a future recording on its own, because it kind of warrants its own presentation, I think, but it's a part of this, right? Being in the here and now, focused on the task at hand, and you know, this sort of non-judgmental acceptance of what it is that's happening is maybe tied into that as well. So it's also our ability to shift focus when we need to as part of concentration. So we don't get our attention so narrow, we're focused on the right thing, but then when we need to shift, we need to be able to do that. So that's part of the skill here as well. And I'll share a little story. I gave a presentation to a college basketball team once on concentration and focus and how this was so important for them, and wanted to do some drills. And so I asked them, I said, well, so you hear the term spacing out, right? Like you space out, you do that when you're sitting in a classroom, you do that when you're sitting at practice sometimes and coach gets a little bit long-winded. There's all these situations where we space out. And I said, okay, well, so what's the opposite of spacing out? And I'll never forget what this athlete said. He said, spacing in. I'm like, yeah, that is the opposite. That's not what I was looking for at all, but that's exactly it, okay? Because spacing out is when we're so focused on something that is not where we are, right? It's like we don't blink for 2 minutes when we're spacing out. Our mind is gone. Our body's there, but our mind is gone somewhere else. We're so intently focused. We're concentrating on something that is irrelevant to where we are and what it is we're doing, right? It's disconnected. And so that's spacing out. A lot of times spacing out gets this bad rap as if like, man, you're not focused. It's like, no, they're so focused that they're not paying attention to anything going on here because they're paying attention to something outside of here. So the opposite of that, concentration in terms of a performance mindset is spacing in. We need to be able to space in, okay? So that's what we're getting at. That'll be kind of our working definition here for concentration as we move forward. So with that, I want to address this attentional overload and underload idea. Okay, it can go in both directions and it can affect our ability to concentrate because we really can only think about so many things at a time. So this whole multitasking idea, right, is really we're just shifting our attention from one thing to the next. And this is the modern day living society that we live in, is we have all of these things competing for our attention. Notifications coming from different apps on our phone and devices, and people are calling us, and then there's people who are around us. There's so many things demanding our attention or seeking our attention, and we really can only think about so many things at a time. So it's easy to be overloaded, right? Whereas underloaded, it's like I'm bored because there's not things to think about here, and so maybe I get fixated on something that's really not relevant, or I'm not bringing in enough things. Okay, so preventing overload, some ways we can do that, right? If we're talking about a learning situation, you have an athlete and they're trying to learn a new skill. How can we prevent overload for them? Well, you need to simplify the process. Instead of throwing the entire thing at them and all these lengthy explanations, use progressions, use skill breakdowns, right? And make it smaller chunks to what it is they're learning, and then vary that, of course, right? Because if we want to optimize learning, we want to randomize the things, have more variety. It's not just practice one thing until you master it and then move on to the next thing, which is like the classic traditional approach. It's have all these little simple things. Okay, we're going to practice this thing. Here's the simple little thing. Go, give it a try. Okay, now try this thing. Go, give that a try, right? And we make it small, digestible chunks to prevent that overload so they know what to focus on. And we also need to simplify strategy and decision making. So athletes can go in situations and they like, oh man, well, I just didn't know what to do there. Okay, and it can be hard to think through that in the moment. They don't know what to pay attention to. So you can preemptively prepare for some of that using these if-then statements, right? If this happens, then I do this. So then I don't have to try and process it in the moment because I'm having too many other things to try and pay attention to. It becomes a little bit more automatic. And we also can utilize this sort of overlearning or automaticity, concept idea where we can get to the point to where certain things are automatic, that we don't have to think about them because we've overlearned them. We've really emphasized them. So there is this, and again, this is like the traditional approach. Just practice one thing until you master it. And there, at some point we need to do that to make sure we have that automaticity, but we want to have variety along the way to simplify it as we're going forward, to try and combine those couple of ideas. So moving on, we have this choking idea that some of you have heard about. I'm sure we have all heard of, we've seen examples of this in sport, like, oh, you choked, man, what was it? Like, how? Now, we've seen it. How do we explain the phenomenon, and why is it in a recording on concentration or attention? Okay, so that's a key part of what it is. Sure, there could be some confidence, motivation, some other different things going on, but it tends to be really tightly linked to concentration. Okay, so our attention, when we're choking, when they're in the middle of that, we see an athlete do that, their attention becomes too narrow, right, involuntarily, and usually becomes internally focused. So they start looking inward instead of outward, and so they start paying attention to these things that maybe they never thought of before. Okay, all of a sudden, so if a golfer, they don't think about their swing before, now all of a sudden they start thinking about their swing and their mechanics and all the things that are happening with that swing as they're swinging, and their attention is not where it needs to be, right? And sometimes it can happen because there's pressure and all these other different things that are going on, and that really can negatively impact their performance. Okay, so manipulating or changing our concentration is one way to gain control over activation levels as well. Because if we have an athlete and they're kind of involuntarily shifting their focus, it goes narrow, it goes internal, right? And then they start to get stressed, they get anxious because their performance is going down. So our concentration can help with that. We can focus on different things. We can use music, right? We can focus on our muscle tension. We can focus on our heart rate to gain control over some of those things. And when we're feeling anxious in a choking situation, we actually want to shift our focus from inside to outside, right? Direct it outwardly when our anxiety and our nervousness increase. Okay, so rather than so here's a common example that I run into with pickleball players who I work with, right? Is like, my serve's gone. Where did my serve go? I don't know what I'm doing. And they're trying to hit their serve and it almost looks totally uncoordinated. And they have to learn how to get outside of their mind and look external and focus on the result of what it is that they want to have happen. Okay, so instead of, or even just the ball, right? Seeing the ball instead of like, what, I need to take my paddle back here and drop the paddle head down and then swing in an upward motion because it's an underhand serve. Like, those are all more internal mechanic based local foci, right? That they're focusing on. So we need to shift outward and say, okay, what's the effect we want to have on the ball here? I want this spin to be generated. Then I'm not thinking about how I'm generating that spin. I'm just talking about the end result. Okay, can be powerful. Now, so that can be helpful in that moment, but sometimes athletes will go through a choke for, a couple innings in baseball, a couple of holes in golf, and learning to recover is probably more important than trying to eliminate it altogether, because it happens to a lot of athletes, and it can be demoralizing if it becomes a runaway train. Okay, again, with the golf example, golfers may have a couple of bad holes, but that doesn't mean it has to be 10 bad holes in a row, right? And so adopting that sort of mindset, I've got to be able to recover. I can recognize and eliminate the physical feelings associated with the tension I might be feeling, right? I can change that. I can take some deep breaths in. I can try and manage my arousal level or stress or anxiety. And we talked about that in a previous recording. We can bring those things in. And part of it is we need to know how our activation is that we're feeling, how that affects our attention, right? And as athletes, we need to reinterpret those physical feelings that we have as facilitative. Okay, so we want the task to be focused, not internal, not too narrow during our performance. And there's different techniques we can use, which I'll touch on, including pre-performance routines. Okay, so here's the ultimate takeaway from this idea, though. Okay, is we need to learn how to get out of our head and get into our body. Okay, and what I mean by that is we need to focus on our actions and feeling that comes from that, not the mechanics, not step by step, not cognitive parts of the movement and what it is we're trying to do. It's get out of our mind. Okay, right here, get into our body and feel the movement and focus on the actions, the outward effects that we want to have for whatever the sport is that we're doing. Okay, so this is a really, really, really powerful tool right there. Get out of your head, get into your body if we experience a little bit of a choking episode. Now, moving beyond that, as I've kind of talked about this sort of internal or narrow attentional focus that we can have when we're in the middle of a choke, right? There's dimensions that we can use to classify attention, and depending on the sport, depending on the position in the sport, will determine where we're at on this dimension at any one time. So this just provides kind of a nice way, a working model for how to classify this, right? Because different performance situations have different attentional demands. Okay, and a key thing to understand is that most performers, they shift their attention throughout a competition. It's not just a single focus the whole time. So you hear that expression from coaches a lot. It's like, focus. Like, well, what do I focus on in this situation? Okay, it needs to be more specific than that for sure. And an athlete's ability to shift their attention efficiently and effectively is going to impact their overall performance. Okay, so we have these two dimensions internal and external, okay, looking inward or looking outward, the effect of what it is. And then we have a broad focus and a narrow focus on the other dimension, okay? And then the overlap of these creates these different attentional foci that an athlete could be using at any given time. So there's assess is a broad external focus, okay? We're zoomed out, we're looking outside of ourselves on what we're focusing on, we're assessing the situation, okay? So a tennis player who's about to hit a serve may be looking outward at the overall situation, see where their opponent is standing, what the wind is doing, right? Reading all these different things to assess where they want to hit their serve, okay? That's a broad external focus. We also can have a broad internal focus, and this is where we may be looking more internally and say, well, I'm analyzing the tennis match results. I'm looking at my strengths, I'm looking at my weaknesses, right? It's directed inward, but it's still pretty broad. I'm painting a broad brush here to analyze the situation. Okay, so it can be broad external, broad internal. We can move over and have a narrow internal focus now, okay, where we're rehearsing very specific aspects of a skill from that internal perspective. So we're feeling our way through it more so. It could be one way to describe that, okay, but it's almost more like we're kind of thinking our way through this particular thing. So for example, the actual execution of a tennis serve. A tennis player may focus on hitting up, right, on the ball. So I'm going to toss that ball up in the air and I'm going to focus on hitting up, right, hitting up. So very narrow part of the movement and very internal with something that it is that I am executing, okay? So then we go beyond that and we have a narrow external focus, which is focusing on a very specific external aspect of the situation, okay? So this might be once I've hit the ball and I'm in the tennis point, right? To continue with the tennis example, I may really focus on tracking the tennis ball itself as it's going back and forth, or I'm trying to read my opponent, okay? So it's pretty narrow, I'm not paying attention to the crowd, not paying attention to the ball boy or girl, or how my shorts feel as I'm running around the court, right? It's this narrow external focus outside of me, okay? So the key takeaway from this is that this is just a way to classify our focus, right? Okay, so it gives us a working foundation, but athletes need to know what to focus on and when to focus on it. And this is what can be trained. So how do we develop that selective attention? How do we know what it is we need to focus on, and then how do we train it? So the first component is we need to develop a mindset for this, a mindset for paying attention. It is a mindset. We have to focus in, right? And again, this is something that I think in modern day society is really hard because our mind is trained to do the opposite. We are jumping around and paying attention to all these different things for just a short little blurb, just a short little tidbit, an Instagram photo, a Twitter X post, right? Anything that's brief and short. We have bombarded constantly in our news feed and social media, all of those things. That's developing a mindset for the opposite, to not have sustained focus, okay, on what it is that we're doing. So we have to develop a mindset and say, okay, I'm going to sit down and grind in terms of focus and concentrate. So we can use video training as well as a useful tool. So lots of different ways that we can use this. We can use it where we're actually watching a video of ourselves and sort of replaying in our minds what it was that was happening, or we're watching the video and we're having a coach or someone guide us along on what are the things that we should be paying attention to in this situation. I think virtual reality has potential here as well. There was a video training putting you in there, and even it could be like some sort of video game situation here. Pay attention to this. But you see this in match or competition analysis on videos all the time, where it's like broken down in slow motion. Here you see this thing right here, so we're going to break this down and look at this, and so we can learn what to pay attention to using that tool. And as a part of that, we can note what the important cues are. You could actually write these down in a journal, in a log. I think that can be powerful. It's like, hey, this particular thing happened and I want to remember that for the next time. So I pay attention to those cues. So here's an example. When I was in my first couple of years in college, I was playing a college basketball game. I was sitting on the bench and I was watching the game unfold and I was actually paying attention. Sometimes you can zone out when you're on the bench. If any of you ever been on the bench before, you sit there and the action's going on, but you're not in the action, so it can be harder to pay attention because you want to be in the action. But I was paying attention to what was going on, and I watched this one of the players on the other team just burn one of my teammates, right? Burned one of my teammates with this particular move on this play. And so coach yanked my teammate, put me in his place, and then a couple times up and down the floor later, this opponent on the other team, he got the ball, same play, same situation, tried the same move on me, and I just locked him up because I was paying attention to the right thing, right? I was paying attention at the right team and I was at the right time. I was reading this guy's body language. He had this little shimmy he liked to do before the move, and it was predictable where he was going to go when he did that, right? So learning what to pay attention to. So we want to use performance-related cues, okay, and this is tied into that just general cues itself, okay, but not focused on the outcome so much. So I gave the example of the tennis serve, right, up or spin, right, or through the ball, right, 3 balls, whatever. There's all these different cues that we can use related to performance to execute the skill the way we want it to be. We also can use focus plans. Okay, so we can design a plan for, okay, we're coming into the 4th quarter, this situation, what is it we need to focus on when we get there? You have a plan for that. When we get into a particular situation, you can anticipate the types of things, the general types of things that might happen, and we can have a focus plan for that. So we already kind of know, we've already gone through that legwork up front in our preparation to help us know what to pay attention to. So how do we prepare for distractors? Because you can have all of those plans and those tools in your back pocket that you want, and you're still going to have distractions. And like I said, in the world we live in today, there's distractions, man. There's things just pulling us in 1,000 different directions. So how do we prepare, right? Just a couple of easy tidbits. So simulations can be good. You see coaches do this with their teams. They'll bring in crowd noise, make their, you see this in professional sports teams, football teams, for example. They're going to go play in a stadium and they get these loudspeakers and they're trying to disrupt everything that's going on with the noise. Another personal example, I remember playing in a conference championship game when I was in high school, and the game was tight in the 4th quarter, and I remember coming out of the timeout onto the floor, and the noise was so loud. I was looking at my teammates are talking to me. I can't hear what they're saying. We're yelling at each other, can't hear what they're saying. Going, whoa, man, we didn't prepare for this in practice. This is crazy. It's really, really cool. So we can try and prepare for those sorts of things. So put ourselves in pressure situations. Coaches try and do this by saying, okay, well, if you miss the free throw, then the whole team's got to run, right? And those sorts of things where you put some pressure on there. Maybe that's not the best example, but it is something that's used. The weather, the time of day, put ourselves in those things that could detract from what it is we should be paying attention to. Okay, and then imagery, right? Did a recording on this previously, how to unlock the power of imagery. This is a great way to do it. We can see ourselves in our mind, rehearse everything that it is we want to do, and seeing the very things that we need to pay attention to can help us prepare for those distractors, especially if we see ourselves navigating it successfully. That is even better from an imaging standpoint. So now I want to take this a little bit deeper. How do we sustain that focus, right? We can develop selective attention with some of the things I've mentioned. How do we sustain the focus long term? More tips, more useful ideas here. So first is this idea of effortless effort. So it's like easy intensity. It's relaxed intensity are terms that I've used previously. If you've listened to me present, These are terms I like to use, and that's really what it is. It's like we can't try harder, concentrate, focus. Like you can't make yourself do that. You have to adopt that mindset, but we can't try too hard with it because then it becomes strained, right? And it can't be strained. It has to be this sort of effortless effort or relaxed intensity of focus. So that's part of that mindset idea. Mindfulness, again, being here, being now, being present, just having that awareness. You can have some of those other thoughts that come in to our minds that might be irrelevant, and we just let them float away, right? Just because they're there doesn't mean we have to give them all this attention. Like, hey, and we don't have to get upset about it. Hey, what are you doing here? Well, see you later. This is what I'm doing. I'm focusing on this. So we can try and become what we are doing. This is that sort of flow state that sometimes leads to being in the zone, where it's just where we are enjoying what it is we're doing for the sake of doing it. So you see there's overlap with all these things: concentration, mindfulness, the flow state. How do we sustain focus? We're becoming what it is we're doing. We have to be able to turn it off and turn it on. So again, I use a number of tennis examples, but you could pretty much see it in most any sport that has start and stop, a start and stop sort of rhythm to it. Okay, football is this way for sure. There's a play, a break, all this stuff happens in between. Okay, the play starts. So we're turning our focus on and off on the things that we need to do. And so it's you'll see, again, tennis players, they usually have routines in between points that help them with this. Okay, so they have their midpoint, their focus that they have during a point, and then in between they have these routines, these things that they go through, so they can keep their focus on relevant things or things that aren't going to allow them to get distracted. So the whole crowd's doing this, all that, the lightning outside, I don't know, things that are going to pull our attention away from what it needs to be. So trying to develop that can be powerful. And one of my college coaches really cemented that in my brain, is that routines are really good for this. It gives you something to focus on. So you don't have to think about how worried you are about how you're going to perform, or the other things, your dog died, or what your dad's going to think when you're done. You have a routine to focus in on, to narrow down that focus. And then we got to practice. Okay, we can practice this. You can practice this brushing your teeth. Okay, it's a classic example: brushing your teeth, tying your shoes, things that normally we don't pay any attention to. We just do it. It's automatic. So then we're thinking about all these other things. Okay, and we can tune back into that. Doesn't mean we have to think about how we're doing those things, and then that can disrupt it. Like, oh, am I choking? I don't know how to tie my shoes anymore. It's like, no, you're just feeling it. You're experiencing it. You're being there, being present. So the mindfulness idea again. So some drills you can do. This is kind of some of the fun stuff. There's a lot of things that have been designed for this, but I'll share a few of them. So quieting drills, you can use self-talk cues if your mind starts just getting overwhelmed and overloaded and you have all these different things going on. You can do quieting drills where you have these self-talk cues like cool it, relax, man, easy, zone in, right? And you attach things to those cues or those anchor words that you use, that you have created in your mind in practice. So you come up, identify what those are, and then you do these quieting drills. Okay, so we can use those. We can use triggers, which is just like a light switch. Okay, when do I need to turn this on? When do I need to turn it off? So I have some trigger that's going to get me right back to where it is that I need to be. So something that I say to myself, something that I do: snap the wrist with the rubber band, straighten my strings on a racket, slap myself on the thigh, whatever. We have these triggers that we've created that help us tune back in like a light switch to where we need to be. And then we have releases. Okay, so if we have those thoughts that we are kind of fixated on, that we don't want to have in our mind, we need to find ways to release them. Okay, so Ken Ravizza, I've mentioned him in the past. One thing he did in the dugout with Major League Baseball players is actually brought a toilet into the dugout. So they have a bad play, they walk past the toilet, they had to flush that last play down the toilet. Okay, so just there's some symbolism attached to that. That's an example of a release. Okay, so you have that thought there. That's not bad that it's there. We have to figure out how to let that thought go and then use a trigger maybe to get back on to where we need to be. And other tips here is we can either look internal. with something that's very simple and controllable, like breathing, right? Or external on some objects that are outside of us. Okay, so like, man, I've been looking internal too much and I'm feeling a little shaky, focusing on the mechanics of what I'm doing. All right, pick a tree, right? Pick a fence, pick a goalpost, pick something outside of yourself that maybe is relevant to your performance, would be even better, right? To help us focus back in on what we need to do. So you can develop this in practice, right? That's the key with this. We can do these drills. Today we're finding releases, things, ways that we can let this go. Visualize a boat in your mind that's floating down the river. Here comes that thought that we don't want, but then it just keeps floating down the river. It doesn't get log jammed in our brain, in our mind. And we need to develop a plan, right? So we need to recognize what it is. We need to stay relaxed and then refocus. Okay, so some key components to that plan that we can drill in practice. And it doesn't, this can be in combination with our physical practice. This can be on its own. Either way, we need to be doing these things. Now, lastly, I'm going to share just a few other techniques that might be useful for this. These are things that we use for sure. Dress rehearsals are a big one. Really can be effective for particular sports that are more closed, right, rather than open-ended. It's like, well, I don't know, it's not like you can prepare every situation that you might be in, okay? But like gymnastics, diving, synchronized swimming, those sorts of things, dress rehearsal is going to be really, really powerful because it's a closed environment. You're going to go in there and you're going to be able to execute your routine to a T, okay? And it's going to be really similar to what you did in practice. So dress rehearsals can be good. Simulations can also be good. So this is what a lot of coaches will do. You do the 2-minute drill, right? For example, at the end of a game, you got less time to kind of march down the field and execute your things. So you create these simulations that might be a lot like what would happen in a competition, but it's still open-ended. We can do mental rehearsal. So this is tied in. I'm going to play it out in my mind. I'm going to see there's lots of great examples on the web of athletes doing this. They're playing through everything in their mind and they're seeing all of the scenarios before they happen. We can use biofeedback, right? Something that I don't have a lot of training in, but something that can be powerful out there. And there's some good sports psych consultants who use this a lot with their athletes and try and monitor their heart rate or their breathing rate, heart rate variability, these different things that are going on in our body, and we try and connect those with the attentional things that we need to attend to, right? And lining those up. And then routine. So this is something that I mentioned that's really, really, really a helpful thing to use. If we have a routine, right, it can be a pre-competition routine, it can be a competition routine, either a recovery routine, whatever it is, routines are really, really, really useful. So out of any of the things that I've shared with you in this presentation, well, a key takeaway is we can develop these routines, and this is one of the best ways to get us to focus on the right things, okay? Especially when that focus is going in and out, it's shifting, build routines into that because it gives you something to focus on. And then a lot of athletes, it's like, well, it's superstitious. What it is, it's just part of their routine. That's how they prepare. It helps them focus on the right things. And so the cool thing about that is it can be highly individualized. You can add your own flavor to it. If it ends up being a little bit superstitious, whatever, so what, right? You're doing it because there's a specific mental attribute that you're trying to enhance. And that's the idea with that and why it can be really powerful. So it really can be ritualistic in many ways, and that's okay. So centering is another one that we can use where we're basically just kind of centering back on the moment or what basically. I guess I could be more specific with this. With centering is you're centering on the moment, but you're also doing it physically. Okay, so you're undergoing this process to kind of adjust your body weight around your center of mass, so you feel centered. You feel physically centered is the idea with that. Okay, so doing that physically can help you get there mentally. Lots of techniques on this. So with that, to review, concentration is our ability to selectively attend to relevant cues, right? It is that sustained focus. So it can be overloaded for sure. Sometimes it can be underloaded in the other direction. If we're overloaded or we're focused on the wrong things, or attentional focus becomes really narrow and internal, that can lead to choking. We have those different dimensions of attention on those dimensions of broad and narrow and internal and external that help us sort of classify. And the key with that is that athletes need to be able to shift their attention in and out depending on what the situation calls for. And there's so many different drills and ways that we can develop this. I certainly didn't mention them all. Routines are the big one. That's a big takeaway, right? Come up with those routines, use all of the different things in addition to that to develop your ability to concentrate, and watch how it improves your performance. Just watch it. So thanks for listening. Have a good one. I'll see you on the flip side.
Thank you for listening to this recording in the Sports Psych Lecture Series. I hope you learned something. More importantly, I hope you learned something that you can apply in your life. Feel free to share this presentation with others who might be interested. And if you're interested in more content like this, visit the Fehr Advantage channel on YouTube, or find the Fehr Advantage podcast on Spotify, or visit my website at fehradvantage.com.